Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our talks with Walt, as we're calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to passage 42 of Song of Myself. Now put this in your notes right away. These last 10 poems of Song of Myself are in many ways a section unto themselves, 42 to 52. They're the last fifth of the poem Song of Myself. That's another way to think of it. I like to think of it in musical terms. And Whitman, it's clear, has been thinking about his poems in musical terms. This is the crescendo. Do you know this term in music? The crescendo. That is to say, we're coming to the penultimate end, and you're going to get that sense right away. We also like to point out that as we finish Leaves of Grass, Song of Myself, that we will hear increasingly an integral voice of Whitman, the poet's voice. Now it's going to become, though, write it down, the teacher's voice. I said this to you in much earlier lectures, that Whitman began his career as a teacher at the age of 17, even though, remarkably, he didn't have any formal education past the age of 12. But by 17, 5 years later, he wanted to be a teacher. And I think he stayed a teacher all his life, just really through Leaves of Grass as a poet. We'll see that teacher's voice. So put that in your notes as well. We're going to hear that teacher's voice. It is a new message. It's a message of faith and harmony, and we're going to see that for sure happening as early as passage 42. Now the key line, as I've said to you, is from passage 4. Both in and out of the game, and watching and wondering at it, I witness and wait. We're going to understand why, again, that's such an important passage for 42. Now my hope is that you've been with us for all 24 poems of inscriptions, that you've been with us for all 19 sections of Paumanok, starting from Paumanok, and that you've been with us from the intro lecture of Song of Myself up through passage 41. Okay? Now it is significant that in the notebooks, Whitman actually wrote this line, I will be the poet of slaves and masters of slaves. It's fascinating. He wants to join both of those together. Now let's turn to passage 42 and just pay attention to the way he plays that game. In the 1855 edition, by the way, of this poem, there is an ellipsis before the first line of 42, as he numbers it in the deathbed edition, a call in the midst of the crowd, my own voice, orotund, sweeping, and final. Now, I wish that I could read this entire poem and then exegete, but I'm going to go ahead and work with sections of 42, and we're going to start now with the first two lines. Notice, he recognizes the last 10 sections as a call in the midst of the crowd. And it is, of course, Whitman's voice in the midst of all the other poetic voices. Whitman wanted his voice to stand out, and so he does. Notice as well, my own voice, and of course this has been a poem about voices. Orotund means impressing, right? Especially as it relates to harmonics. Sweeping and final. Now, what's interesting is that the poem itself was never final. Right up until the end of his life, Whitman was editing these poems. But by sweeping here, we get a real sense of what he wants. Something that's encompassing everything. We use the term integral. Then, I told you so, very first word, the deathbed edition was the word come. Again, it gets repeated over and over. Notice it's the first word of the next two lines. Come, my children. Come, my boys and girls, my women, household, and intimates. Now the performer launches his nerve. He has passed his prelude on the reeds within. Now let's just pay attention. The teacher's voice. Speaking to students. Here it's children. Here it's boys and girls. And then of course notice the use of the word my women, right? Household and intimates. So in other words, I'm including everybody. Women, children. Now the performer, and that's what he calls himself, launches his nerve, right? That is to say, the finale. He has passed his prelude on the reeds within. In other words, it's time for the ending of this poem. Easily, ironically said now, easily written, loose-fingered chords. Now, the elided verb here, he instead of loose-fingered, E-D-R-E-D, it's that elided verb. We've had much to say about this earlier, trying to capture the American cadence. By the way, there was an exclamation point at the end of the word chords in the 1855 edition. I feel the thrum of your climax and close. By the way, in the original 55, it's their climax and close, and now he makes it more intimate with your climax and close. Now, of course, this is ironic. We know from the notebooks, and you assume it from your close study as you've been working with me of these lines. Nothing about this is easily written. Like we know of all great writing, it takes a lot of hard work to be able to make what it is that we're working with here. Notice, loose-fingered chords, I feel the thrum. And he loves a word like thrum, because of course it has all that onomatopoeia stuff that we learned when we were in 3rd grade, right? Of your climax and close. Now we are reaching the climax, and of course we've heard this word climax as it's related to any number of different ways. He's talked about what he's producing here in Leaves of Grass. Then he turns to himself. My head slews round on my neck. Music rolls, but not from the organ. Folks are around me, but they are no household of mine. Now this is interesting. First of all, in the 55 edition, he didn't say slews around. He actually used the word, believe it or not, evolves. Read it as, my head evolves on my neck. It's a fascinating, in the time of Darwin, here he is writing with the word evolves. He decided to play around with slews around, which is, of course, a much more American kind of usage. In other words, I am constantly working, is his point. Music rolls, but not from the organ. And again, the identification with music here, as we said, this is the crescendo. Folks are around me, but they are no household of mine. This is a fascinating way to say, I'm going to include everybody in my poems. Everybody makes America. Not just some, all, everyone. And then he begins with 11 repetitions of the word ever. Now, do you guys remember when we messed around with Nietzsche's eternal recurrence? That idea that things come back again and again and again. You'll remember that we said Hegel, this is the way he read history. Notice, ever the hard unsunk ground. Notice how many times we've heard about dirt and ground here, right? Ever the eaters and drinkers. Ever the upward and downward sun. Ever the air and the ceaseless tides. In other words, life is about rhythms. Remember, we can use the term religious to talk about rhythms. Anything you do repeatedly is a religious activity. You brush your teeth religiously. That is to say, over and over and over again. Notice here, ever myself and my neighbors, refreshing, wicked, we think of starting from Apologetics passage 7 and his views on evil, real. We're going to get to the last 3 questions of this poem in a bit, right? That is to say, ever the old inexplicable query. Can you put it in your notes? That's what this whole project's been about. An inexplicable, translinguistic query. It's all been about our questions, and we're going to hear more about this when we get to that penultimate passage of 46. Ever that thorned thumb. Now, this is, of course, the thorn in the flesh reference here. In other words, something that's very difficult, challenging. We might even say vexing, right? That breath of inches and thirsts. There it is. What a beautifully poetic way to talk about curiosity. Hey, if there's anything that has kept you with us all the way through all the previous readings and all the sections and all the lectures to now, it is, in fact, the breath of inches and thirsts. The curiosity that holds us. Ever the vexers, notice italicized being used here. It wasn't in the 55, it is here. Ever the vexers hoot hoot till we find where the sly one hides and bring him forth. In some ways, that's what Leaves of Grass has been. I'm going to bring everything out into the light of the sun. Ever love, ever the sobbing liquid of life. Remember our life lumps from the earlier passage, right? We're back to the sexual language again. Ever the bandage under the chin, ever the trestles of death. That is to say, the supports which hold up a dead body, right? We're going to hear this in BB drums, by the way, so make a note of it at 3 and we'll come back to it. The trestles of death. Here and there with dimes on the eyes walking. Now that's a compelling image because they would put dimes on the eyes of the corpse so that the eyes wouldn't open. But here, notice, they're walking. In other words, Whitman sounding very much like Wordsworth in Tintern Abbey, very much like Wordsworth in The World is Too Much With Us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Notice the dimes are on the eyes. In other words, he says people spend too much time, look at the next line, to feed the greed of the belly, the brains, liberally spooning. In other words, we've given our hearts away, Wordsworth will say, a sordid boon. We care too much about getting and spending. And so Whitman now, as the teacher's voice, is going to begin to instruct. Tickets buying, talking, selling, but into the feast never once going. In other words, we work and we work to acquire all this stuff and we never actually seem to get any reward. No joy. Where's the joy? Where are the Scooby snacks, if you will, right? Many sweating, plowing, thrashing, and then the chaff for payment receiving, sounding very much, of course, like Marx's argument about how for most working people, they spend all of their time working and they never get any results of their work. A few idly owning, and they the wheat continually claiming, right? That is to say, there's this few group of people that want to make everybody else work so they can somehow take off the top. This is, again, Whitman has a very kind of Marxist, sometimes socialistic view of the whole notion of work and the people who end up doing most of the work at the factory that never actually get any money from the factory. We've given a number of lectures on this idea already at learnstrong.net. This is the city, and I'm one of the citizens. So notice, the teacher is one with the students here, and we're going to see this recapitulated over and over again. This is the city, I'm one of the citizens. Whatever interests the rest interests me, and then what are those things? Politics, wars, markets, by the way in the 55 it was churches, newspapers, schools, and then there is an interesting missing line that he edits out with the mayor and councils, banks, tariffs, steamships, factories, stocks, stores, real estate, personal estate. He says it this way: benevolent societies in 55, improvements, banks, tariffs, steamships, factories, markets, stocks and stores, and real estate, and personal estate. And then he says it this way: those who piddle and patter here in collars and tailed coats. I'm aware who they are, and that they are not worms or fleas. I acknowledge the duplicates of myself under all this scrape-lipped and pipe-like concealments. Now his rewrite of that runs this way: the mayor, councils, banks, tariffs, steamships, factories, stocks, stores. Notice brilliant juxtaposition: real estate and personal estate. The little plentiful mannequins. Now this is a mean line. It is a harsh line. The little plentiful mannequins skipping around in collars and trailed coats. He's kind of making fun, of course, of the people who kind of control so much of industry, but they themselves are somehow little, and they're like mannequins. I'm aware who they are, and then in parentheses, they are positively not worms or fleas. In other words, I'm going to include them. I acknowledge the duplicates of myself, whoever that might be. The weakest and shallowest is deathless with me. Very inclusive. What I do and say, the same waits for them. Every thought that flounders in me, the same flounders in them. Go back and look at passage 1. Every atom belonging to me as well belongs to you. I know perfectly well my own egotism. Now this is interesting. Whitman will say it out loud. Oh, no. I know who I am. I know at times I seem an egomaniac, my own egotism. Know my omnivorous lines, in 55 it was words, and must not write any less. In other words, I gotta write what I gotta write. Okay? I gotta write what I gotta write. And would fetch you, whoever you are, flush with myself. The use of the word flush, of course, has double meanings. That is to say, conjoined. It can have sexual rendering as well with the word flush. Not words of routine. By the way, the 55 edition, he says, my words are words of a questioning and to indicate reality. But now in the edited version, not words of routine, this song of mine, but abruptly to question. There it is. I would write it down. That is Whitman's teacher's voice. He learned this from his study of Socrates and Christ. The most important thing that a teacher can ever do is to challenge the student to think. And of course, the teacher will do that through questions. So notice here he'll say it, right? But abruptly to question, to leap beyond yet nearer bring. There it is. I mean, now put it in your notes. This is what we call pedagogy. P-E-D-A-G-O-G-Y. Whitman pedagogy. The idea of how one should teach children, how one should teach young people. And he says, this is what I'm always trying to do. I'm going to challenge you that you are going to leap beyond, but then be nearer to an answer. Okay. This printed and bound book, notice we're coming to the end now, right? And we're commenting on the very specifics. This printed and bound book, but the printer and the printing office boy. In other words, you cannot have product without creator. Which is more important, the poem or the poet? An interesting question. Which is more important, the artist or the art? And then notice he'll play this game again. By the way, another missing line that's kind of fascinating. He says, the marriage estate and settlement, but the body and mind of the bridegroom, also those of the bride. The panorama of the sea, but the sea itself. And he edited those out, and he just went with this. The well-taken photographs, but your wife or friend close and solid in your arms. The black ship mailed with iron, her mighty guns and her turrets, but the pluck of the captain and the engineers. In other words, there is all sides of the equation. That's how I would say it. Whitman wants us to remember there are all sides to the equation. In the houses and the dishes and fare and furniture, but the host and hostess and the look out of their eyes. In other words, there is the physical, but there's also that spiritual element. The sky up there, yet here or next door or across the way. In other words, look both up as well as down. The saints and sages in history, that is to say backwards looking, but you yourself. What about what you bring to the equation? Sermons, creeds, theology, we think of creeds in schools and abeyance from passage 1, but the fathomless human brain. Don't overlook that you have to find answers within yourself, he says. Even though obviously we're learning about the answers provided by saints and sages, sermons, creeds, and theology. And then finally he ends with 3 powerful questions, which might be the reason that you'll keep reading for the rest of Leaves of Grass. Certainly these are the questions that motivated Whitman in his own life. And what is reason? And what is love? And what is life? Now, you could make the argument that there are the 3 questions of what it means to be a student, right? And at 2a, let's finish now. This is, in fact, the challenge of the teacher to the student. Learn to ask those questions. What is real? What is love? What is life? If you can find answers that work for you for those 3 questions, you've done something, and therefore your education has been more than just your schooling, right? At 2b, again, 11 times the word even is used, that anaphoria, we pointed that out. At 3a, I'm just going to mention here Emerson's The Poet as well as Oversoul, his essays we've talked about elsewhere at learnstrong.net. But, and of course, Thoreau's Walden. But I'm going to mention here Shakespeare and Milton. Think about the fact that both of those great writers were constantly asking, what is real? What is love? And I mean, you know, what in the end, what's it all mean? What's the meaning of all this? What is life? Finally, at 3b, well, there it is. How do you answer that question? What is reason? What is love? What is life? Do you have answers to that? And are you getting any better at understanding those 3 questions because of our talks with Walt? I would hope that you are. Thank you.